Some boys feel that they're girls. Some girls feel that they're boys. Now, when a minor is diagnosed with gender dysphoria, psychiatrists can prescribe a variety of kinds of treatments. Puberty blockers, hormones like testosterone for girls, estrogen for boys, or surgeries, breast removal for girls, genital surgery for both girls and boys. But Tennessee comes in and it says, nope, not in our state, not for minors. Some plaintiffs went to federal court in Tennessee and said this is unconstitutional. They were quickly joined under the Biden administration by the United States itself. The core argument is not that this statute is trans discrimination. The core argument is that it's sex discrimination. A lot of lawyers are completely hung up at just this moment. States are routinely permitted to ban minors from engaging in conduct deemed to be potentially harmful. There was no reliable data currently existing showing medically beneficial effects of these treatments on minors. I just don't think the Constitution of the United States takes a position. The Constitution doesn't ban these procedures, but it doesn't say there's a constitutional right to these procedures either. Hello everyone, I'm Jed Rubenfeld and this is Straight Down the Middle. Today we're going to cover the trans case. That's United States versus Skrmetti. You may have been reading about it in the newspapers. It's a case involving a Tennessee statute prohibiting medical sex change procedures and drugs for children. Now, I know this is a hot button issue. People feel very strongly on both sides. Everybody knows that. In fact, some people are calling this the most important Supreme Court case of the term. But most people, truth is, they don't actually know what this case is about. They don't know what the real constitutional issues are. So, I'm going to break that down for you. I'm going to go through those constitutional issues, some of which are very complicated. I'm going to tell you in advance, it gets pretty tricky. But I'm also going to tell you something else in advance, which is that despite all those complications, to me, I don't really think this is such a difficult case. Now, I guarantee you there's going to be a dissent in this case, but in my view, this law will be and should be upheld. Why is that? Very simple reason, because it only involves minors. The statute leaves adults completely alone to do whatever they want with their bodies. It just applies to minors. And look, there's a ton of stuff we don't let minors do with their bodies because we think it's harmful. We think, minors aren't old enough to make those decisions for themselves. We don't let minors smoke. We don't let minors drink. We don't let minors get tattoos, for heaven's sake. And now you're going to tell me there's a constitutional right for a minor to have her breasts removed or get genital surgery, irreversible genital surgery? I just don't see it. So let's get to the case. 2023, Tennessee passed a sex change statute applicable to minors. It banned doctors from giving minors puberty blockers, hormones like testosterone and estrogen, and from giving them surgeries, breast surgeries or genital surgeries, on the basis of a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. That is, they couldn't do those things for the purpose of effectuating a sex or gender change. Now, the law, once again, only applies to minors. And by the way, it allows these treatments, for example, testosterone or estrogen, to be given to minors for other conditions. It just says, nope, not on the basis of a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. So you might be asking yourself, gender dysphoria, what the heck is that? And guess what? That's a pretty good question. Not so easy to answer. And in part, that's because there's a little bit of a taboo about this subject. You're not supposed to ask questions. You're just supposed to accept that there is this thing called gender dysphoria. But I think we can do a little bit better than that. So let me try to explain. Dysphoria, well, that's just a fancy Greek word for unhappiness. But gender dysphoria, that's supposed to be a psychiatric condition. What does that mean? It means that medical authorities have concluded and tell us that there is a mental illness or psychiatric disorder in which people suffer serious distress as a result of a supposed conflict between their actual biological sex and the gender or sex that they experience themselves as having or wish to present themselves as. In short, for minors, some boys feel that they're girls or want to be girls or want to present themselves as girls, and vice versa. Some girls feel that they're boys or want to be boys or want to present themselves as boys. Now, if that causes them serious, sustained distress, they are diagnosed with gender dysphoria. Now, when a minor is diagnosed with gender dysphoria, psychiatrists can prescribe a variety of kinds of treatments. They can and they do. Some of them can be very invasive. For example, puberty blockers, hormones like testosterone for girls, estrogen for boys, with the purpose of increasing masculinity for girls and femininity for boys, or surgeries, of various invasive and potentially irreversible kinds. Breast removal for girls, genital surgery for both girls and boys. Now, all this is pretty new. Doctors didn't do this until a few decades ago. A doctor who did some of these things to children up until a few decades ago would have been probably seen as committing malpractice, maybe even have been seen as committing a crime. But over the last 30, 40 years, doctors have started to do this all over the world. And in the last 15, 20 years, it's gotten much more common. But Tennessee comes in and it says, nope, not in our state, not for minors. You can do all this stuff for adults. Adults can do whatever they want to their bodies, but not in our state, not for minors. And what happened was that, of course, the law, the new statute, was immediately challenged. Some plaintiffs went to federal court in Tennessee and said this is unconstitutional. The original plaintiffs were some minors who had been diagnosed with gender dysphoria, their parents, a doctor, but they were quickly joined under the Biden administration by the United States itself. So the United States intervenes in the case as a plaintiff, joining the plaintiffs, arguing that the Tennessee statute is unconstitutional. Now, what arguments did the plaintiffs make? Why was the law supposed to be unconstitutional? Well, they made a variety of arguments in the lower courts. They said, look, the law violates due process. It deprives minors of fundamental rights. They also said it violates the parents' rights to decide what's best for their children. And they also said it violates the equal protection of the laws. Now, I'm stressing that because as the cases come up to the Supreme Court, that's really the only issue that's in the case and before the court, the equal protection issue. That doesn't mean the other issues are gone. It just means that that's the only issue and argument that's before the court in this case. So that's the argument, the equal protection argument, that I'm going to focus on in this episode. Now, what exactly is the equal protection argument against the Tennessee statute? You might think, since the Equal Protection Clause bans discrimination, you might think that the chief argument, the core argument is this statute is discriminatory against trans people. That's why it's unconstitutional. That's why it violates the Equal Protection Clause. But believe it or not, that's not the core argument. The core argument is not that this statute is trans discrimination. The core argument is that it's sex discrimination. Let me repeat that. Chief argument made by the plaintiffs in this case before the Supreme Court is not that this statute is an unconstitutional instance of trans discrimination. The argument is that it's an unconstitutional instance of sex discrimination. Well, wait a second. I'm having trouble understanding that, you might say. Which sex does it discriminate against, this Tennessee statute? Does it discriminate against boys or does it discriminate against girls? Answer, according to the plaintiffs, both. It discriminates against both girls and boys. Well, hang on, you might say, I don't understand that. How can that be? Well, if you're having that reaction, that's a good reaction. I'll get back to that. But to explain how plaintiffs can make that argument, I need to tell you something about equal protection law. So guess what? A little bonus here, you get a primer, get a little summary of modern equal protection law. Here's how modern equal protection law works. Modern equal protection law works by applying different tests, different so-called standards of review to different laws depending on the kind of classification they use. Some of these standards of review are much more lenient than others. Most laws, in fact, almost all laws, are tested for equal protection purposes under so-called mere rationality review or rational basis review. That's the most lenient standard. If a law gets tested under mere rationality review, guess what? It's going to be upheld almost every time. That's an almost surefire guarantee of constitutionality. And that's how most laws are tested under the equal protection laws, and it's for that reason that most laws, almost all laws, do not violate the equal protection clause. But some laws, a few laws, are subjected to a more heightened scrutiny, depending on the classification that the law uses. What does that mean? How does that work? Here's the prime example. A racial classification, a law that treats people differently on the basis of their race. You get a law like that, that gets subjected to super strict scrutiny and will almost always be struck down. But in addition to racial classifications, are there any other classifications that also trigger heightened scrutiny? Yes, there are, a very few. One of them, sex classifications. If a state passes a law engaging in a sex classification, treating people differently based on their sex, that law is going to be subjected not to the same super strict scrutiny that applies to racial classifications, but nevertheless to a very demanding scrutiny. If a state passes a law treating people differently on the basis of their sex, The state has to show an exceedingly persuasive justification. That's the test for the statute. The state has to show, again, I'm giving you the test, that the law substantially furthers important governmental interests. Okay, that's the test, and let me give you a couple of examples so you know how it works. Using that heightened scrutiny, the Supreme Court has struck down, for example, a state statute banning women, excluding women, from the state's top or most prestigious military academy. The court said, you can't do that. The law denies women important opportunities that it gives to men, and it does so on the basis of demeaning stereotypes being applied to women that aren't being applied to men. So that's unconstitutional under heightened scrutiny. By contrast, the court has upheld under the same heightened scrutiny a citizenship statute. This gets a little complicated. A citizenship statute that applied a higher burden of proof to men when they're trying to show that a child is their biological child than it applied to women. The court upheld that. This, by the way, was for kids born out of wedlock. The court upheld that on the basis of the fact, as the court found it, that proving paternity, proving that a man is the biological parent of the child, is harder to do than establishing maternity, which is established, that is, that the woman is the biological parent of the child when the woman gives birth to the child. And the idea is there will be birth certificates, records of that event. Okay, so those are examples of how heightened scrutiny for sex classifications works. And now we can turn back to Skrmetti. Plaintiffs in Skrmetti say this statute is sex classifying, has to be tested under heightened scrutiny. Tennessee says, no, it's not sex classifying, it needs to be tested under mere rationality review, which it clearly passes. So which is it? Well, this is where things get complicated. Things are going to get a little tricky. I'm going to walk it all through for you so you understand the arguments, but I got to tell you in advance, all the complications that I'm going to go through, they're not actually the core issues in the case. They're kind of a red herring in my opinion. But before I tell you why, I want you to understand the arguments for and against the Tennessee law being a sex classifying law. So here's the argument that says, yeah, it's sex classifying. Plaintiffs say, of course it's a sex classifying law. Every provision in it is based on the minor's biological sex. Just read the statute. The statute prohibits certain treatments like puberty blockers, hormones, in order to enable the minor to identify with a gender inconsistent with the minor's biological sex. That's what the statute says. Come on, give us a break. It's obviously sex classifying. Now that's not a crazy argument, and I fully expect some justices of the Supreme Court to embrace it. But there's a reply. Tennessee says, what are you talking about? Our law isn't sex classifying. It applies to boys and girls completely equally. It says neither boys nor girls can undergo sex change treatments while they're minors. It treats everybody the same. It doesn't matter if you're a boy or a girl. You can't do a sex change, drug treatment, or surgery. What's your problem? It's not sex classifying. Now that's also not a crazy argument, and I expect some justices of the Supreme Court to accept that argument. Problem is, plaintiffs have a reply to that argument. Here's the reply. They say, hang on a second. The argument that Tennessee just made to you, that very same argument was rejected in an extremely important Supreme Court equal protection case decided back in 1967 called Loving versus Virginia. Now Loving, very important case, struck down an interracial marriage law. Virginia had passed a statute banning blacks from marrying whites and whites from marrying blacks. That's right. As late as 1967 in this country, interracial marriage laws were common throughout the American South. But in Loving versus Virginia, the Supreme Court said, nope, unconstitutional. These laws violate the Equal Protection Clause. And in the course of that ruling, the court rejected an argument similar in some ways made by Virginia to the argument that Tennessee is making in Skrmetti. Virginia said, our law isn't race classified. What are you talking about? It applies to both races equally. Blacks can't marry whites, whites can't marry blacks. It doesn't matter if you're black or white, you can't engage in interracial marriage. So it treats everybody the same. It's not a racial classification. The court did not buy that for 1 second. Said, give us a break. The law prohibits blacks from marrying whites, whites from marrying blacks. That's a racial classification, strict scrutiny, unconstitutional. So plaintiffs in Skrmetti, they say, see this case just like Loving. Don't believe Tennessee when it says our law applies equally to both sexes. That's exactly what Virginia was saying in Loving versus Virginia. Court rejected the argument there. Court should reject the argument here. Now, if you're starting to get a little confused, not sure what to think in this case, that's the right reaction. This is confusing. A lot of lawyers are completely hung up at just this moment. They're fighting about whether the case, Skrmetti, is exactly like Loving, totally different from Loving, so they're hung up right here. So let me give you my view about that, but I'm going to tell you that it's kind of unsettled. But here's my view. My view is that in a certain narrow sense, the plaintiffs in Skrmetti have the better of the argument. Here's what I mean. In Loving, one thing you could say is that the key to the case was that Virginia's racial intermarriage law, banning interracial marriage, actually allowed whites to do something that blacks couldn't do, and allowed blacks to do something that whites couldn't do. Now, you might not notice that first, because on the face of it, the statute says nobody can engage in interracial marriage, or at least blacks and whites can't engage in interracial marriage to each other. So you might think that's all the same. But if you look carefully, the statute is permitting whites to do something that blacks can't do, and vice versa. Well, Professor, what's that? I'll tell you exactly what it is. Whites can marry white people. Simple as that. Blacks cannot. Say a man in 1966 in Virginia married a white woman. Has he committed a crime? We don't know yet. We don't know till we know his race. If he's black, he committed a crime. If he's white, he didn't. Now, any law that works that way, that lets members of one race do something or get something that it denies to the other race, that's going to be found to be a racial classification. It's going to be subjected to strict scrutiny under current American equal protection law, and it's almost always going to be struck down. Okay, now let's come back to Skrmetti and apply that same analysis. At first, when you look at it, the Skrmetti statute, Tennessee statute, looks like it's not denying either sex something that it gives to the other. Both sexes are denied the right as children to engage in certain sex change medical treatments. But again, if you look more carefully, Tennessee's statute does allow boys to do something girls can't do, and it allows girls to do something boys can't do. Well, what is it, Professor? What does it allow boys to do that girls can't do? Boys, for example, can take testosterone to increase their masculine features, musculature, facial hair. Adolescent boy could do that. Tennessee law would not prohibit it. Could a girl do the same thing? Could she take testosterone to increase masculine features, facial hair, musculature? No, she cannot. That's exactly what she cannot do under Tennessee statute. Flip it around. A minor girl in Tennessee can get breast augmentation surgery to enhance her so-called feminine appearance. A boy cannot get breast surgery to enhance his feminine appearance. That's what the Tennessee statute precisely bars. So the Tennessee statute does in fact allow boys to do certain things that it does not allow girls to do, and it allows girls to do certain things it does not allow boys to do. And from that narrow point of view, you could say, yeah, the Tennessee statute is sex classifying and is sex discriminatory after all. So I said that from a narrow point of view, the plaintiffs have the better of the argument there. And they can say that the law is sex discriminatory in just the way that I described to you, and they can compare their case to Loving. But in a more fundamental sense, maybe they've left something out. Maybe in a more fundamental sense, the law is not sex discriminatory and is not like Loving. And let me explain to you what that might mean. Every sex classifying statute that the Supreme Court has held to heightened scrutiny and has struck down as sex discrimination, to my knowledge, has been of the following kind. It has discriminated against one sex as opposed to the other. It has elevated one sex over the other. It has applied to one sex demeaning stereotypes that it did not apply to the other. Is that true of Tennessee's statute? It does not appear to be true. Remember, opponents of the Tennessee law who want to say it's sex discriminatory, they say it discriminates against both sexes. They don't say that the law elevates boys over girls or girls over boys. They don't say that it applies demeaning stereotypes to girls, that it does not apply to boys, or vice versa. They don't say that. They don't say that this statute is a male supremacy law or a female supremacy law. Now, was that true of Loving? Could you say that the Virginia statute banning interracial marriage was a white supremacy law? Or, like the Skrmetti law, Do you have to say, no, it's not a white supremacy law, it's not a black supremacy law, it's neither? No. In Loving versus Virginia, that anti-interracial marriage law was obviously a white supremacy law. Everybody knew it, and guess what? The Supreme Court of the United States said so. It said, and I quote, that Virginia's provisions were measures designed to achieve or attain white supremacy. It used those words explicitly, and on that ground, the Supreme Court of the United States said that violates the Equal Protection Clause. That makes him unconstitutional, period, forget about it. But that's different from this Tennessee statute. So the Tennessee statute, well, it may be the first time that the Supreme Court has ever confronted a statute said to be classifying sex discriminatory, but that does not discriminate against one sex as opposed to the other, does not attempt to elevate one sex over the other, does not apply to one sex demeaning stereotypes that are not being applied to the other. And I gotta tell you, on that ground, I'm not sure whether 6 justices of the Supreme Court are going to find that such a statute constitutes sex discrimination under the 14th Amendment, because it's so different from the kinds of statutes that have been found to constitute sex discrimination under the 14th Amendment. I think there's a good chance they're going to say this is not the kind of sex discrimination that the 14th Amendment prohibits, because the 14th Amendment prohibits state statutes from elevating one sex over the other, and this statute doesn't do that. But wait, that brings us back to the question of whether this statute discriminates against trans people. Professor, couldn't plaintiffs say that even if this isn't a case of unconstitutional sex discrimination, it's still a case of unconstitutional trans discrimination? Couldn't the Supreme Court hold that even if the law doesn't trigger heightened scrutiny as a form of sex classification, it does trigger heightened scrutiny as a form of trans discrimination, that trans status is another suspect classification. Trans people are another suspect class for equal protection purposes. Couldn't the court say that? Yes, they could. But will they? That I very much doubt. Here's the problem. The court has not recognized a new suspect class in decades. The court does not confer suspect class status for equal protection purposes on many groups that have long been subject to discrimination in this country and that still are. The court does not recognize older people as a suspect class. The court does not recognize physically disabled people as a suspect class or mentally disabled people as a suspect class. The court doesn't even officially recognize homosexuality as a suspect classification. So I just don't think that a majority of the Supreme Court is going to find that there's a new suspect class out there consisting of trans people, or a new suspect classification consisting of trans status. They haven't done it in so many cases. They've refused to do it in so many cases. I just don't think they're going to do it here. Okay, we have finally come to the end of the whole classification issue in Skrmetti. All the arguments for and against why this should be seen as the kind of classification that triggers heightened scrutiny. Now I'm going to tell you why I think that that's a red herring in this case, that all those complications are not the core issue. Here's why. Once again, it's just what I said at the beginning. It's because this statute involves only minors and only unproven medical treatments. Now, let me remind you, we stop minors from doing all kinds of things we let adults do, on the ground that the conduct in question could be very harmful to them, and that minors, they're not old enough to decide what's best for them. Examples: alcohol, smoking, tattoos. We don't let kids do it, so why should this case be any different? Well, here's a possible answer to that. Well, Professor, I'll tell you why it's different, somebody might say. Because constitutional rights are at stake. You've just been talking for half an hour about the constitutional issues of this case. Constitutional rights are at stake, so it's totally different. Alcohol, smoking, tattoos. Nobody's got a constitutional right to any of that stuff. Those cases don't count at all. Now, I'm not sure that objection is well taken. I'm not sure that there are no constitutional rights at stake in tattooing, for example, and I'm not sure there are constitutional rights at stake in Skrmetti. But even if we accept the objection for all it's worth, it's still not a very good objection. Let me tell you exactly why. Because we don't let minors do lots of stuff that adults have a constitutional right to do, an established, accepted, unquestioned constitutional right to do. Simplest example, voting. Kids can't vote. Adults have a constitutional right to vote. Another example, pornography. Adults have a constitutional right to buy pornography. You can ban obscenity, but states are not allowed to ban pornography. Adults have a First Amendment constitutional right to buy pornography. Guess what? Kids are not allowed to buy pornography. So again, you have a case where kids are prohibited from doing something that adults have a constitutional right to do. So why is this case any different? I don't think it is. Now, If Tennessee had passed the following kind of statute, boys can buy pornography, but girls can't. Or girls can buy pornography, but boys can't. Boys can vote at the age of 16, but girls can't. Girls can vote at the age of 16, but boys can't. That'd be a different story. But remember, whatever you think of the Tennessee statute, and I know feelings run very high about this, but whatever you think about it, it's not that kind of sex discrimination statute. It doesn't discriminate against one sex as opposed to the other. It doesn't elevate one sex over the other. It doesn't apply to one sex demeaning stereotypes that it's not applying to the other. So it's not that kind of case. Now, what kind of case is it? Well, to summarize, states are routinely permitted to ban minors from engaging in conduct deemed to be potentially harmful. They can do it as adults, but they can't do it as minors. What we could say at a minimum is this: if a state has a plausible, evidence-based reason for believing that certain conduct could be very harmful to minors and isn't otherwise really important and necessary to them, there's no problem. There's never been a constitutional problem in banning minors from engaging in that conduct. So we got to ask, does Tennessee have that kind of plausible evidence-based basis for being worried that these sex change procedures for minors are potentially harmful to them and are not medically necessary to them? Answer, I think the answer is pretty clearly yes. Pro tip, here's a mistake that a lot of people fall into in this case, especially folks opposing the law. They think that Tennessee has to prove that they're harmful and prove that they're not medically useful. In other words, the burden is on Tennessee to prove harmfulness and medical inappropriateness. But that's not right. All over the law, states are permitted to ban minors from doing stuff if they have a good reason to worry, to be concerned that the conduct in question might be harmful and isn't medically important or something like that. So that's what Tennessee has to show. It doesn't have to prove that these medical treatments don't work. It has to show that they're unproven, that there's reason to worry, a good, plausible, evidence-based reason for Tennessee to worry that these are unproven medical treatments that could be irreversible and potentially very harmful to children. And on that score, it looks on the present evidence that it's very easy for Tennessee to make that case. Let me give you the background on this. I'm not a scientist. I'm not going to try to go into all the data and studies, but I can give you the lay of the land. Here's how it went. For years, activists and some doctors in America and all over the world were saying that kids suffering from gender dysphoria needed these treatments, or else they would kill themselves. Now that kind of argument, that's very powerful for parents and for doctors. If kids need these treatments to avoid suicide, well, that's a heck of a good reason to give them the treatment. Problem: the studies on which those claims were being based turned out to be unsound, arguably almost fabricated, but unsound. And now it's almost universally agreed that there is no good data showing a reduction in suicidality for kids given medical transition treatment. Even the plaintiffs in Skrmetti acknowledged that there was no reliable data that medical sex change drugs and surgeries for kids reduced suicidality. But wait a minute, Professor. There are a lot of other medically beneficial effects other than reducing suicide. Maybe there's a lot of reduction of distress and unhappiness. Maybe these treatments are medically beneficial in other ways. Well, that's what the Solicitor General said in her brief to the Supreme Court. She said there's overwhelming evidence that these treatments produce medically beneficial effects for children. Problem again. That statement by the Solicitor General of the United States appears to be false. Just recently in America, there's a big study that was done. Multi-million-dollar government-funded study looking at all the data about puberty blockers and hormone treatment for kids, sex change treatments for kids, and it failed to find medically beneficial results. And for that reason, the data was blocked from being published. Now I'm going to repeat that because it's kind of shocking. This is according to the New York Times, which has generally been quite friendly to the trans movement. Major study in America failed to find medically beneficial effects from puberty blockers or hormones such as testosterone or estrogen given to children diagnosed with gender dysphoria. And the lead author of that study, because she wanted the study to find that there were beneficial effects and she was very worried when it didn't, the lead author of that study kept the data from being published. And that's not the only such study. In fact, very recently, a highly respected report came out of the UK that's called the Cass report, and it found the same thing. Deep dive, all the data, all the studies, and it found there was no reliable data currently existing showing medically beneficial effects of these treatments on minors, and instead found that the potential harms and long-term risks for minors are completely unknown. Now, some medical experts have gone much further and have said much more worrisome things. For example, there's a very prominent psychiatrist out of Sweden, Dr. Christopher Gilbert. He's very highly respected. He's award-winning. He's famous and has done some famous things in the field of pediatric psychiatry. He came out and said that pediatric transition, that means medical sex changing for minors, pediatric transition is one of the greatest scandals in medical history, or maybe one of the greatest scandals in medical history. And he called for an immediate moratorium on the administration of puberty blockers to minors. So that kind of thing is very worrisome indeed, and in my view, amply justifies a state like Tennessee in putting a halt on the present evidence to puberty blockers, hormone treatments, and surgeries for minors as a diagnosis for so-called gender dysphoria. Now, I'm going to give you the bottom line on this. I'm going to summarize. Summary is, I just don't think the Constitution of the United States takes a position on this issue. Folks are debating it all over the world. People feel very strongly about it. Some people say pediatric transition, sex change for minors, much needed medical care. They call it gender affirming care, a euphemism I will not use. Other people say it's a form of child abuse. Now, I'm not saying that the evidence out there proves that one of these sides is right, proves that one of these sides is wrong. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that the Constitution of the United States does not take a position in this debate. The Constitution doesn't ban these procedures, but it doesn't say there's a constitutional right to these procedures either. And if the Constitution is neutral, if the Constitution doesn't take a position on this, well, then Tennessee's law has to stand. Now, there's two different constitutional routes you can take to arrive at this conclusion. You can say, one, that Tennessee's statute, because it applies only to minors and only deals with unproven medical treatments that are potentially highly invasive and highly harmful to kids, and doesn't discriminate against one sex as opposed to the other, doesn't try to elevate one sex over the other. You could say that for all those reasons, it's not the kind of sex discrimination, sex classification that triggers heightened review. It's just a rational basis case. That rational basis test is easily satisfied. The law is to be upheld. Or you can say something very different. You could say, yeah, well, even if the law does trigger heightened scrutiny as a sex classification, it should still be upheld because the state can show that it has an exceedingly persuasive justification, namely that these treatments are unproved under the present evidence and could be very harmful and could be irreversible and are very highly invasive, and that that worry, that concern we have that kids are doing something very harmful to them that has not been proved beneficial, that's a sufficient, exceedingly persuasive justification to satisfy the test for heightened scrutiny and to allow this law to pass. Now, either way, and you can say either thing, straight down the middle's conclusion is Tennessee statute is and should be found constitutional. Okay, that's all for today. Hope you enjoyed it. Stay tuned for more episodes of Straight Down the Middle.